Hey, Jamie here. Going to talk today about section 6.2 from AP Biology on natural selection and some types of natural selection. Okay, first thing to remember is natural selection is the adaptation of a population, usually either to biotic or abiotic environment. So the living things in the ecosystem or the non-living things in the ecosystem, those two things. So there's some important things to remember. Number one, that there's variation, that there's differences within that population, phenotypic differences that give them different amounts of fitness, and that variation, number two, can be inherited. That is based on traits that can be passed on. Number three, that variation affects survivability. So the things are different, which makes them better or worse, gives them a better or worse ability to survive in their ecosystem or their environment. And number four, that it affects their ability to reproduce and pass on those traits. Natural selection favors the variant that is most adaptive, or sometimes you'll hear most fit or has the highest fitness to the current environmental conditions that those organisms or that population reside in. When there's a difference in how things can survive and natural selection occurs, remember that then results in a change in the frequency, the frequency of alleles in a gene pool. Those changes in frequency we talked about earlier this chapter as microevolution, micro meaning small. This is where we discussed Hardy-Weinberg and the different frequencies that they came up with, and how that improved fitness of the population over time may shift. And that's what we want to look at. There's three main types of natural selection that we want to look at. There's directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. And I forgot to mention on the first slide, we're looking at mostly polygenic traits. Traits that are controlled by two or more genes. And what you tend to get with those are a bell-shaped curve, where most are average, and then you have your extreme phenotypes on either side. So the types we want to look at are directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection, and how that peaks. The original dotted line here is the original bell curve, and how that may shift or disrupt that bell curve. The first one is directional selection, and just like it, like the name sounds, we're moving the bell curve either one direction or another towards an extreme phenotype. So one phenotype is selected against, and the other extreme phenotype has a better survivability rate. And the example your book uses is in drug-resistant bacteria, antibiotic resistance. So you have a population of bacteria that might be growing in a person. They take exposure to drugs, they take antibiotics. It kills off right away. It doesn't kill very many, but the longer you take the antibiotics, the weaker non-resistant cells are killed off. And if you don't take all of your antibiotics and kill all of these things off and allow your body to fight them off, you get a few of the original population surviving and a lot of resistant bacteria surviving here. And you're like, oh, I'm feeling better. And so you don't take all your antibiotics. You leave a few of the original bacteria along with some of the resistant bacteria. And over time, you are selecting for mostly bacteria that are resistant. We used to use penicillin for everything. Now we find that we can't really use it for everything anymore, because if we look at our curve here, penicillin used to work for just about everything. But then every time someone was sick, we prescribed it, even if it was viral, and we know antibiotics don't work against viruses. And this curve started to shift, okay, over time to where now we're mostly resistant to that. So we need stronger and stronger antibiotics to deal with populations of bacteria that are resistant to ones that we used to use. A lot of because of prescribing them and also misuse, not taking all of them. So this is directional selection. That bell curve is moving, okay, is moving in one direction towards one extreme phenotype away from another. An example of stabilizing solution that I often use in most of my biology classes is human birth weight. If you look at the average birth born across the world, you'll see that there's this bell curve, and it's this very narrow curve. Okay, and again, this is in kilograms, but 2.2 kilograms is about 4 pounds. 3 kilograms is about 6 pounds, and 4 is about 8 pounds. So you see this narrow range of like 4 to 8 pounds. Okay, that's a very narrow birth weight. Well, why is that? Well, throughout human history, before we had all the modern medicine that we do now, if it was premature, the baby was really, really small, okay, there was a high mortality rate. If the baby was too big, again, complications with birth, with mother, and there was complications with that. So that took the curve and squeezed it together into this very narrow, what we call stabilized bell curve around the very narrow range of phenotypes. Now with hospitalizations, we can keep babies alive that are younger, and also big babies in C-sections. It would be interesting over the next couple hundred years to see if this bell curve doesn't start to sort of widen out again because of the medical technology that we have. The last type of selection with polygenic traits is disruptive. Okay, that is where the pressure is going to be against the average, and it's going to select for both extreme phenotypes. So what you get to see is this bell curve beginning to dip in the middle, less average and more extreme. Example often used are these land snails, where the darker shells are found more in the forested areas, and the lighter colored shells are more in open areas, grasslands, where a lighter color tends to be more camouflage. And so you see these two populations, the bell curve will actually split and pull apart from each other. And not to skip too far ahead, but in future chapters, if this continues on, you might get what we call speciation, where they might become so different that the two populations wouldn't recognize each other anymore, and you'd have two separate species. The last little part we want to talk about with natural selection is sexual selection. This is adaptive changes in males and females that lead to an increased ability to secure a mate. Because remember, part of having traits that are different is the ability for them to be passed on. So when when organisms look for mates or who they breed with, that determines which types of adaptations would be passed on or not passed on. With males, they're competing with other males for a mate. And females, are they selecting a certain mate based on certain traits because of fitness? And that will, that increases the likelihood that certain traits are passed on. One of the things we look at is female choice. We'll look at the females first. There's kind of two hypotheses that we look at. The good gene hypothesis, in which females choose mates on the basis of traits that improve their chance of survival. An example you'll see in a later video are in times of drought, the finches on the Galapagos Islands will actually choose mates with bigger, thicker beaks, because during a drought, the food sources are drier. And so that gives them increases their chance of survival during that drought. So sometimes we think maybe females will choose a mate based on survival, a trait that increases the chance of survival. Or number two, the runaway hypothesis, females choose mates on the basis of traits or appearance. Okay. Now, the reasons it's called a runaway is because these appearances can become extreme. One of the really cool examples, if you've watched any of the BBC, Planet Earth, those type movies, is the birds of paradise, and sort of their very extreme examples of different dances or feather coating patterns, these long sort of tail feather things here, and these funky dances. It's got its wings kind of pulled up behind it, and it's doing this dance. Look at the difference between male and female in these two. This is what we refer to as sexual dimorphism. Okay, morphology, shapes, and too. So you get this very different male-female type of appearance because the females keep selecting for, these very extreme feathers and dances and stuff. So the runaway just gets more and more and more extreme over time. You get these really cool phenotypes that occur in plants and animals. Secondly, we discussed the male competition a little bit. Males are obviously not giving birth to the offspring in most species, and so they fight to father as many offspring as possible. And so they compete with the females in their herd, in their group, to be the fathers. And so you often get sort of this leader of the troop that is kind of the dominant or alpha male. But there's a cost benefit analysis. To get bigger and bigger horns, that takes more energy to get around. It's harder to get around. To fight off, to try to fight to be that dominant male. And then once you get to be that dominant male, it takes a lot of energy to defend your position. So is it worth that cost and that extra energy to be able to access more of the mating with the females? And so there's kind of this balance of being able to be that dominant male and fight for the ladies, but not use up all your energy and the resources in the process, or you will not stay in that position very long. And so you can kind of see the roles that natural selection has played in different populations over time.